I think we really need to rethink the way we speak to one another and the way we speak to the younger generation and the way we speak to ourselves. And it can go too far. We've all met those people who are absolutely confident with no basis to be. They are absolutely lacking in self-awareness. They are horrible. And that's not very good either.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be on this constant journey of, you know, this mixture of believing in ourselves and believing in the outside world and kind of coming to an equilibrium and pushing ourselves while still, taking feedback on board, but disregarding feedback that's not effective or correct. And it's that's I think the journey of life, becoming good
Yeah.
at that.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Delighted to have you here. And I was fascinated this morning when I read about this huge iceberg. And the way it was phrased in the article was the iceberg has finally decided to move on. And I find that on a scale unfathomable because it's almost like 3 times the size of New York City, maybe bigger. And it's this vast chunk of ice that was grounded. And when they say it like that, it's like almost it was not given permission by the what do they call it? The dock master or the port authorities to move ahead in its journey because it was carrying like illicit drugs. I love that word again, illicit drugs as opposed to kerosene. And it's almost like we need to give permission to this vast movement of nature in our words, and like we have control over it, right? Because 4,000 square kilometers of ice on the go. And it just shows the scale sometimes that we don't really understand, because we think of things in a very human context of how big things are, how big is the shuttle was or the space rocket that SpaceX launched. And it's quite remarkable in that way what we've achieved and the scale of things that we've achieved, the bridges and the dams and the other constructions and the tunnel across or under, the tunnel over, these things connecting two mountains. But just 4,000 square kilometers of ice. And some of these things are just mind-bogglingly beautiful. And that thing's on the move. And it's picking up steam like there's a secret mission inside which has these, I don't know, earthlings, which are not us or who are not us, controlling and directing this massive chunk of ice. And I just find that crazy, that some of the things that we are witnessing now are prehistoric in their formation. They're unbelievably huge. And that's the scale the earth works on, right? It doesn't think of 100 years of industrialization, 50 years of climate change, or 40,000 or whatever years, or 400 years of carbon CO2 emissions, and 10 years of smartphones. It's thinking of, okay, I'm going to give it some time for this to grow. And we don't talk about like, oh, until he graduates high school, but like, let me give it a couple of million years, maybe 200, just to be on the safe side, for these things to develop, to take shape. And then we'll see when to move them. Let it be grounded for how long? 5 minutes, 1 hour, 10 days? No, not on the scale of patience that human beings have or don't have, but let it just sit there. Let it just fester. Let it just think about what it's done for 50,000 years, give or take some change. And I love that scale of things. And we find that unbearingly unthinkable, because for us, it's a shot. Because it's what, 8 years, 10 years is 1/10 of our life, if we're lucky. Or maybe it's more like 20% of our life. And we can't understand that these things take time and these things are beyond our control. They're beyond our lifetime. And when we put panic buttons on to things that have been shaping up for the past 300 years, 400 years, we think that, my God, that's a long time frame. But yeah, the earth and all its systems and all its functions just laughs at that. If there was a laughter track, or there were a bunch of people who were looking at us running around like headless chickens, with headless chickens, and how those headless chickens are contributing to all these things that we are doing in our time frame. It's laughable. It's like, man, let these kids play. They'll be done in their break, and then we can actually come back and get a move on with the plans that we've hatched 500 million years ago. And I love that. I love the vastness of that. I love the depth of that. I love the unthinkable nature of the fabric of time that we can't even understand. And hats off to the iceberg to show us that that your timeline has absolutely fuck all to do with my plans. So you worry your little heads about it, humans, because you can have your conferences, you can have your oil rigs, you can have your fossil fuels, you can have your EVs, you can have all your hashtags and your new movements, but I'll be sitting here playing my waiting game because it has no effect on me. It only has an effect on you if I melt because I were you. Anyway, I just love that idea when I read that this morning. 4 fucking 1,000 square kilometers. That's what crazy. Anyhow, that's my just my nod to the planet and all its vast systems. But let me talk about systems in place that we've put in. And to join me today to talk about crime and mental health is Jahan Kalantar from Sydney, Australia. He's a lawyer, he's an entrepreneur, he's a speaker, and he works for the Executive Law Group. And today I want to understand what it is we are neglecting to acknowledge, which is the criminal justice system, because it seems to be the final frontier to solve all the society's problems, all the social injustices, all the crimes, and all the things that we perceive as criminal in the fight of good over bad. But Jahan's here to talk about the cases he's worked with, the individuals, the nature of the criminal justice system, how mental health contributes to a lot of it, the symptoms of the problem, the underlying causes of all these issues, the societal stress that we're experiencing, the injustice of some of the situations, and generally what are these trends over the past few years that are causing a lot of the things we see and we put so easily labels onto. So it's a fascinating conversation. I'm sure you'll enjoy it because it affects all of us, whether we know it or not. And there are a lot of underlying tones that we pick up on, which is race, gender, socioeconomic disparities, and so much more that is relevant to all of us right now, right here, today. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jahan Kalantar. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to the episode, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the conversation coming up. Jahan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me, Soapy. I've been looking forward to our chat.
Yes, I'm excited to talk about the things. There's so many things that you've been doing, from finance to law, and within law, you've been doing interesting work. But I want to start today's conversation with these two topics, which I read a lot about in fictional context, but you involve yourself in real life with these topics, which is crime and mental health. So could you first of all maybe lead me in with how you got into these two fields, which seem to be, quite niche, but I think it's quite a big population that, has an overlap in these fields.
Yeah, so I've been practicing law for about a decade now, a little bit over, and I never set out to be a criminal defense lawyer. It was not ever on the cards. It just sort of happened to be that when I graduated from law, I couldn't really find a job in certain fields. I had a friend who was a criminal lawyer, and he said, "Come and work with me." And through him, I learned so much. I made some connections and really became, I found something I'm super passionate about. Because before I became a criminal defense lawyer, I think I probably had a pretty naive view of the world and saw people as either good or evil. And I really didn't appreciate much of the gray that goes on. But having worked a lot of public law, so a lot of work for people in low income situations, people on the margins of society, I really started to understand a lot more that people fundamentally, I can say this hand on heart, having dealt with thousands of cases now, that fundamentally people are very good. They may make a terrible mistake. They may have had such misfortune that their behavior is not what we would accept. But generally speaking, people are pretty good.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sort of started to stand out to me is that whenever I was dealing with people who kind of came into contact with the criminal justice system, firstly, many of them had no support or very limited support in their upbringing, and secondly, many of them had underlying mental health issues. Now, mental health does not excuse your behavior, but it does in some ways explain it. And it does, in some ways, inform, perhaps, maybe rather than treating people with a sense of contempt or a sense of, you're a bad person, maybe we should approach it with curiosity and a sense of how can we help this person.
Yeah.
And over the last decade, I've been doing primarily crime, everything from a traffic ticket in the local court all the way up to matters of terrorism and national security, cases pertaining to sexual assaults, arson, attempted murder, you name it, I've worked on it. And really, in that time, I've kind of developed a practice guiding people on what I say is usually the worst day of their life.
Mm-hmm. When someone looks at crime, it's such a wide spectrum of the acts of crime, but also the kinds of people and the motivation behind it. And as you pointed out just now, the intention of people are good, but circumstances sometimes drive them to commit acts of crime out of desperation or out of being cornered by the social pressures and also the systems in place, right? Because you look at someone who's completely back against the wall when they have no money, and maybe there's some other cases where there is it's not money related, but it's emotionally driven, right, where they feel like they are left no choice. But then you look at the other end of the spectrum, which is the cases like Trump, which we're hearing, where it's fraud, or Sam Bankman-Fried, which is privileged people who've got access to mental health support, people who've got all these various tools at their disposal, but yet go and commit crime on a much larger scale. And in some cases, of course, in many cases, it goes, with the best of lawyers, with the best of defense lawyers, they get scot-free or they get on bail. But then you hear about the system which is wrongly convicting people. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but like in a book I read recently, it seems like the American prison system is one of the most well-run, well-oiled machines, which has got so many innocent people incarcerated. I'm sorry, I'm creating quite a broad context here, but I just want to give you my experience and my knowledge of this, so you can comment as an expert, because I could be completely off with my perspective on this.
I can't meaningfully comment on the state of the United States, legal system, and I think you'd be naive to think that there isn't a prison industrial complex in the United States that, as you said, is a well-oiled machine, and that there are sometimes perverse incentives. One needs to only look at those cases like the judicial officer or judge who was putting children in custody because he owned a share in the prison, and stories like that, which are just absolutely harrowing and just go so far against what is permissible and what is acceptable. And when I say a majority of people are good, I mean that. But there are people out there who are bad, or people that are selfish, or people that are entitled, or people who don't know any better, or people who think they're too smart by half. So it's such a complex topic. You can't simply look at it through one lens or one isolated case. In many ways, it's cheating for me, because I only have to tell one person's story. I'm not a criminologist or a sociologist. I don't look at a much broader context. I have the privilege of telling individual stories, but in that I do deal with the system. And I can say that the system here in Australia is crumbling, that it is very difficult to do this job. In the UK, it appears to be the same sort of situation, quite literally crumbling. I was reading a story of the courthouse in the middle of a trial, a piece of masonry falls from the roof. And if that's not a perfect literal example of a metaphorical issue, I don't know what it is. But it's not the people in the system that are causing it to be that way. It's just that it's very hard for people, and I count myself in this, before I did this work, to understand why it's so important to have a functional justice system, because without it, all of those other things that we take for granted sort of fail. If you can't have confidence that when you make a deal with someone, they'll honor it, and if they don't, you can take them to task, well, you'll see people not honoring deals. If you can commit crimes of gain and get away with them, you're more likely to do so. So it's so important to have a proper justice system that enables us to help people and understand the full context.
Because I think Australia and India, we borrowed heavily from the British legal system. in some aspects of structuring of our courts and structuring of things. And um, when these laws are examined in today's context, with especially criminal law, decriminalizing certain things, updating certain things, there's a lot of backlog. I don't know about Australia, but in India, from what I've heard, there's a lot of backlog of cases, and many times people just go waiting for their case to be heard, whether it's in civil or criminal courts. And a lot of times, years go by before justice is served, and in some cases, justice after many years isn't served because of whatever reason. But when we look at these systems in place, which are supposed to serve society and serve people and make sure that the people who commit crime go punished and the innocents are protected, how naive is that statement when I say that as a layperson? I mean, is it as black and white as the bad get imprisoned and the innocent go protected, or is there a lot more gray in it?
It's not a naive sentiment, but it's an incorrect one. There is a lot of gray. And the systems that we've set up are wonderful. If they were properly resourced and they had the things behind them, the ideas of the concepts themselves are beautiful. The presumption of innocence, that you're entitled to have someone speak on your behalf. The fact that, they must prove their case against you. These are very good things, but they come from a time when there was far less cases. Your average judicial officer would have to deal with a lot less. There was a lot less people. The system itself wasn't so clogged. And so justice delayed is justice denied. And it's a very challenging situation. I've had a case I'll never forget. Client was charged or accused of bringing in certain prohibited drugs into Australia.
Mm-hmm.
He was remanded into custody. And it took 2.5 years before we finally were heard, and the matter was finalized, and he was found not guilty. Now, this man has lost 2.5 years of his life.
Yeah.
In custody for something that was proven not to have happened. That's disgusting. Wow. That's disgusting.
Yeah.
And you find these situations all of the time. There are cases where somebody goes, I'll just plead guilty, not because I've done it, but because I'll get out of here faster. And expediency, it makes more sense than justice. And so when those situations happen, it breaks your heart. There are cases where if the person had proper representation, the outcome would be completely different. And that shouldn't be the system, but it's kind of the system we have.
Right. And oftentimes it's racially biased, right? Like in India, it's not racial because it's not so distinct, the races in India. But of course, there is a socioeconomic bias in some cases. And of course, if we refer to America, there is the population bias. And a lot of people say it's more black people, but it's, from, again, my research isn't all factual. A lot of it comes from books which are based in truth. There are a lot of, what do you call it? There's a Latin population, a black population. So in Australia, what is the situation when it comes to the criminal demographic?
I don't have the statistics to back it up, but unfortunately, there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians, so First Nations Australians, in custody. Mm-hmm. That's categorically correct. Right. And there is, and I don't think it's by design, but it happens. And I think that, you would have people who maybe come at this with a bias and say, well, they're probably just more likely to be criminals. But I think that's a completely disgusting, racist and incorrect sentiment. So I think you will see certain there's no question that people with lower socioeconomic outcomes are overrepresented in the justice system. That is a harsh truth. Whether that's because they commit crimes more often, whether that's because they're falsely accused, whether that's because they can't access representation, whether it's, I can't tell you why, but I can tell you it happens. And our goal as a society should be to be creating a society where we set people up to succeed, not punish them if they fail.
Right. No, because when you look at these crimes, right, where, like, for instance, when I visited Australia just once, I went to Perth. I was there for a few days, and the first thing that struck me was, the night we landed, my wife and I were walking to our flat, which we were staying at, and there were a lot of people on the sidewalk, which someone would call homeless people. And I asked someone, they said, yeah, there are a lot of Indigenous people now hooked on to meth. I don't know if it's crystal meth or meth, but alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and these substance abuse, let's call it, in thing, is typically seen in the obviously in the lower economic groups. But when you compare mental health and substance abuse, there's a lot of that happening as well. And I read somewhere recently in America, it's the opioid crisis, which has in today's time, it's a different population. It's the youth being affected by it, but at some point it was the black population. At some point it was someone else. So if you just take away from the people, but you look at the substances and you look at the cause for the substances being used, which is in some case mental health. What are we looking at right now? Is it a certain trend over the years with the cases you're seeing? Is there an escalation in the number of cases with all the various things? Because if you look at the time we're living in, human beings have a lot more access to a basic life. At least it seems like that.
Yeah. It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think I've certainly seen an uptake or an increase in what I've dealt with of people having a relationship with substances, whatever that substance looks like.
Yeah.
I think, though, that when we treat substance abuse as a criminal justice problem, which it can be, it absolutely can be, but when we treat it simply as a criminal justice problem, rather than what I think it is, which is a sociological, mental health, and economic problem, then you really don't tackle the problem at its root. You
Yeah.
tackle some of its consequences, and from time to time, you will stop some people doing it. But for many people, substance abuse is a way of coping with trauma. It's a way of coping with a world that they feel has forgotten them. And if you think that you're going to get someone to stop taking those substances because you're punishing them, that's not necessarily the case. Now, there's going to be a group of people that no matter what you do, they're going to take substances. And then there's an argument about, well, how do we harm minimize? And how do we, do we set up, for example, centers for people to go and receive their substances?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we harm minimize? These are very complex questions.
Yeah.
But me, I think at least I view the war on drugs as having been a failure. I think it has caused unimaginable devastation for the people. I think we need to work towards harm minimization. And I think we need to understand the root causes of this. And I think there's, in Australia, for example, we had what's called a Royal Commission into ice, which is the drug you're talking about, meth. And it had some very staggering and clear findings that we need to think about this situation differently.
Yeah, that's such an important thing that you mentioned, right? Like when you look at alcohol, or you look at whatever it may be, from the most acceptable to the most demonized drug, you don't ask. You look at someone and say, "Oh, he's abusive as an alcoholic," but you don't ask why, what led him to that, right, or led her to that. And the thing is, how can on a scale of which we need to address it, which is when millions are being affected, and the only solution being they're in prison, is what kind of system can be put into place to look at the why as opposed to what they've done because of the why?
That's a great question, and whoever figures that out deserves a Nobel Prize. From my position, I can say this having talked to thousands, so I have a pretty large sample size. There is not a single person that has walked through my door and told me their story who has not at least had one sentence or one moment that has absolutely broken my heart. I don't think I've ever dealt with someone who has not had a moment of just low. And similarly, everyone I've dealt with, even the worst of the worst, has done one or two things that make me proud of them as a human being. And I think it's this understanding that human beings are incredibly complex. We're not the best thing we do, nor the worst thing we do. We're who we are on an average Tuesday. And the solution, I think, is perhaps to begin with this, rather than to begin with it's very, very easy when you're from a wealthy, successful background, you've been educated and you've received support, to look down your nose at someone who has nothing. It's very different and very hard, and I think far more important to, if you're in a different position, help those people up and look at them like a human being and say, how can I help you rather than how can I punish you? Because at the end of the day, it's whether the person was taking this, I mean, whether the person's taking the substance to run away from a trauma, whether they're taking the substance because they're a hedonist. The reality is, what can we do to stop them from taking the substance and show them better options? And if that's a criminal justice solution, fine. But if that's a social justice, or if that's a different solution, fine as well. We need those options.
And that's such a weird thing. Like in Bangalore, where there's, of course, like the rest of India, there's a huge disparity. Now you look at a laborer whose daily wages can barely get food on the table, but he spends, say, $50 on some really bad liquor, gets smashed, goes and beats up his wife. He's thrown into a prison where he's thrashed by the police. But then you have a celebrity son who gets smashed on alcohol, maybe top shelf liquor, then drives drunk, runs over someone, but then gets scot free. And it's the same substance. It's the same underlying, maybe both, maybe one is economic pressure and he's just not able to cope with this thing in the daily wage thing, but the other one may be an unloved child who knows, right? But I'm saying that the outward result is someone getting hurt, which is either the wife or the person this guy ran over. But one is completely ruined by the system because he's beaten up, his legs are broken, he can't earn money. Now that's making the situation even worse. But one just gets away with it because of whose kid he is and the access he has to I wouldn't say the benefit of doubt that the system gives. I'm not saying it always happens, but there've been a lot of examples where this happens.
Absolutely.
So it's very hard, to almost think like, I'm just speaking here as a lay person. When I look at, say, the way these substances are being distributed, right? Like there's a huge uptake of cocaine use in India now, and it seems to be it's not done in the poor population because, of course, it's an expensive drug, but there are things that people do when they want access to drugs, whatever the amount of money you have at disposal. But it almost feels, and this could sound like a conspiracy, and I don't mean to, but I'm coming to you from what I've read and what I've heard. Is there a purpose to these substances? Like when you say the substance is taken to cope, versus is the substance even being put out there, distributed in legal and illegal channels to create this unrest in society for a certain reason? And again, you don't have to answer as a lawyer, because I know there's a lot of speculation involved as a thing, but just as someone who's
Well, I mean,
seen so many cases.
I think, well, let's I want to address firstly your situation of the laborer versus the drunk driver. Instinctively, I think if 100 people heard that story, 99% of people would go, the laborer's situation, while also awful, is much more understandable than the wealthy celebrities thing.
Yeah.
And it's because I think human beings have a built-in sense of fair play. We are evolutionary, there's an evolutionary incentive to be community bonded, which is why loneliness is such a dangerous thing. And if someone is lonely, it's got enormous health implications. Like you would rather be obese and have a safe and a good community safety net than be in a relatively good cardiovascular shape and be socially isolated. That's worse for you. And the studies on that are pretty staggering sort of things. So I think we all have this inbuilt sense of fair play. When it comes to substances, my personal belief is this. I think there's that people in general, firstly, for many people, they should never take any substances. They do not agree with them, and they can open doors you can't close. So if you don't take things, don't start taking things. Okay? Yeah. Because there are some people who take funny stuff and nothing bad happens, and there are others that will destroy your life. Don't roll that dice if you don't have to. Yeah. Secondly, when it comes to funny stuff, I think there's really three categories. There's stuff that makes people go fast, uppers, things like cocaine that you mentioned, that people enjoy that feeling, that rush, that adrenaline. Then there's downers, things that slow you down, like opioids. And then there's things like things like hallucinogens, things who make you see things that aren't there, things like psilocybin, acid, etc. And I think the way people are, I think there's probably a physiological and physical basis that some agree with. I think part of the human experience is a sense of curiosity, and there is something intriguing about being in an altered state of mind.
Yeah.
Altered state of minds are what we really live for as human beings. The problem is, for many, there is something profoundly beautiful. I quite like being in the outdoors, and if you hike for an entire day and you reach the top of a nice mountaintop and you feel that air on your face, and you have you look over and you see a vista, or you hold your partner's hand, that is like being on top of the world. Now that is, but it's hard to do that. You have to take a day off work. You have to have the resources to go there. You have to hike for a day. You can get that from a small bump of a drug. It's understandable why you would do that. And so it doesn't justify it, but it explains it. And I think one of the things is we need to stop this paternalistic telling people don't do that, it's bad, because don't do that, it's bad has failed. Don't do that, it's bad should be part of the response. But if a parent, all they ever did was yell at their child, you would say that that parent is not a good parent, and that child is likely to grow up with some issues. For a parent to be an effective parent, they must have a mixture of love, fear, respect, all of these things. There needs to be this mix. And for us to simply take the fear approach, it's failed. And that's that's what's so upsetting, because people are going to cope with pressure in different ways. Some are healthy and some are unhealthy. We need to make sure that people understand that, generally speaking, drugs are without it being under the supervision and care of experts, drugs are a dangerous thing, and you should be very cautious if you're on them. But if you're going to take them anyway, no matter what people say, maybe we need to look at a way to minimize it. Maybe if that laborer is going to go get trashed and drunk, there needs to be some sort of system where he won't have access to his family or whatever have you. There needs to be things in place. The reality is, with wealth, you can insulate yourself from that. If you can go out and get absolutely trolleyed, the reason I think that story upsets people so much, that the person drinks and then drives, that guy can afford a chauffeur, that guy can afford a cab, right? That laborer can't afford any other options. And for us, that's why when your world is so small, you don't have many options. That's kind of why I think for many people, it speaks to us differently, which was I hope I answered your question.
No, it's got me thinking to more questions. So thanks. Because this idea of good and bad baffles me, right? That there's a good child in class, there's a bad boy in class, there's a good student, a bad student, which might seem as something as simple as a classroom session where, because he shouted, he's a bad student. But then those labels stick on, and then they become more and more limiting, because the opportunity seems to reduce and seems to drive that person down a certain path, which is predetermined by words being used at a young age, for good or bad. But then you see examples of people who drink, they smoke, they probably occasionally indulge in some weed, they might even indulge in some recreational drugs, but they're just helpful, good friends. But then you have someone who's fit, who goes running 30 marathons a month, who's a great student throughout his entire or her career, and ends up going and killing an entire family, right? So I'm saying there's absolutely no need for such distinct lines between good and bad.
Absolutely. Look, the things that are good in one context can be bad in another, and things that are bad in a context, So I have always been quite polite, and I've always been relatively kind. It's something that I've had, and when you're a kind person, or when you're a polite person, there is a group of the population that, for some inexplicable reason, seems to think that kindness is a sign of weakness. And every year, without fail, 2 or 3 times, I need to pull someone aside and say, I think you're mistaking my kindness for cowardice, and let me disabuse you of that right now, because if you really want to get into it, I can show you the iron in me. I don't like doing that, but I can. Now, that assertiveness in one context is acceptable, and in another it's not. It's perfectly fine to be aggressive if you're playing sport. It's, assuming you play within the rules, but it's not okay to be aggressive if you're, at a social event. And so it's quite sad and scary that people internalize many of these stories about who they are, and they go down these roads. The number of people that I think have thrown their lives into a state of disarray because some awful adult told them they're stupid or they're worthless is
Mm.
profound.
Yeah.
It's profound. And the number of people who've had beautiful, meaningful, helpful lives because some adult took an interest in them when they were younger is also profound. I think we really need to rethink the way we speak to one another and the way we speak to the younger generation and the way we speak to ourselves. And it can go too far. We've all met those people who are absolutely confident with no basis to be. They are absolutely lacking in self-awareness. They are horrible. And that's not very good either.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think we have to be on this constant journey of, you know, this mixture of believing in ourselves and believing in the outside world and kind of coming to an equilibrium and pushing ourselves while still, taking feedback on board, but disregarding feedback that's not effective or correct. And it's that's I think the journey of life, becoming good
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah. No, and just since we're on this topic of drugs, it's not like I want the entire conversation to be about it, but it seems like there are certain drugs that encourage violence and aggression. Like you hear of abuse after alcohol, or violence motivated by certain drugs, but then you hear people who are, and of course I'm not making any blanket statements or stereotypes, but then you hear people who are stoned or on an ayahuasca or psilocybin trip, who aren't really harming too many people except maybe the Instagram feed because of all these posts they put up. But yeah, I find that interesting, how certain people are attracted to certain kinds of substances, and as a result that leads them to make certain decisions which harm them and harm others. But then there are certain other decisions which take you down this path of self discovery and self, as you said, this altered state, which seems to give you more of an introspective and a reflective journey, which ends up benefiting you and benefiting people around you. But then there's more abusive, self abusive, and also externally abusive directions that people go in.
I mean, if you were to ask my own personal opinion, I think there is no drug more dangerous than alcohol. I think that
Mm.
alcohol is probably responsible for more sadness, grief, and pain than any other drug in the world
Yeah.
by a factor of 50 to 100, and it's
Mhm.
completely legal in most contexts.
Yeah.
And I think that there are people who swear by the fact they had a psilocybin, experience that changed their life and brought them a sense of peace and clarity. There are studies that show that, for example, MDMA, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or ecstasy, if used in a clinical context, can help soldiers and people suffering from extreme PTSD. There's evidence that ketamine, which is a horse tranquilizer, can be used to deal with extreme depression. These are
Mm.
things that are worth exploring. One of the things that breaks my heart is that we have these tools that no one can utilize in any way, shape, or form because they're labeled as these dangerous substances. Now, there is absolutely, in my opinion, a need to protect the general public from people just grabbing these things and going crazy.
Yeah.
But for us to say that there's no benefit to them whatsoever is also crazy.
Right. No, because you mentioned that, and that's such a it's such an obvious thing, but no one seems like, because I drink and I'm not going to shy away from that, but I've seen the dark side of using alcohol as a coping mechanism versus alcohol as a recreational beverage to relax. But you can easily cross the line before even knowing it, right? And I've traveled to Australia, as I said, to Perth. I've traveled doing comedy to Edinburgh, that's Scotland, to London, England, to the US, and just alcohol in especially the UK and in Australia is very considered a part of daily life, right? A few beers and barbecue or whatever the thing. But I saw the um, I wouldn't say the hesitancy, but there was such a um, unsaid fear of alcohol in Edinburgh because of certain things they have in their society, right? Because of depression, mental health issues, because the servings of scotch or whiskey was limited to a certain dosage. Alcohol of a certain nature wasn't sold in the grocery store. So when you look at of course, I don't expect you to comment on Scottish drinking habits or the justice system there or the mental health system there, but you see um, these themes resonating in cultures where there is um, alcohol being considered as a part of life. But contrasting to that, you see some of these Italian cultures where wine is had with dinner. So I don't know if I'm posing a question to you, but what is this cultural landscape saying about the relationship with alcohol and mental health and a resulting need for violence or causing violence?
I think poison and medicine is usually in the dose.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality. I'm not averse to, from time to time, a nice glass of whiskey or scotch. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
averse to a nice red with some pasta. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not I'm not here to tell anyone how to live their life. I always tell my clients, I advise, you decide. That's the relationship we
Yeah.
have. I'm I advise and you decide. I can advise you of what to do, but you ultimately make the decisions. You're an adult. Now, that being said, I think that things like alcohol, it's very easy to cross the threshold. As a general proposition, I abstain most of the time. I will have a glass on a special occasion, but
Yeah.
I'm fairly into my fitness. I quite enjoy that, and for me, alcohol's the big downside for alcohol is it affects my sleep, and for me, sleep is the most important aspect of keeping good mental health. I have found that if I have a few days without good sleep, my life starts to feel very much out of control and I work
Yeah.
too hard for that. So that is the primary reason I stay away from alcohol, not because I'm violent or thuggish, or it just hurts my sleep.
Yeah.
And it's very hard in Australian society when you're going out and people are like, oh, do you want to drink? And you say no. People look at you like you have a problem. And it's
Mm.
taken a bit of time to build up this muscle. You
Yeah.
know, it's tiring to explain to people, look, the reality is that I'm a grumpy old man. I'm almost 40.
Mm.
I don't, if I drink, I can't sleep. And if I can't sleep, I'm useless. So please leave me alone.
Right.
Um, and it's a hard thing to do. So I can understand why young people generally are quite hesitant, because it's easier to just go with the flow.
Yeah.
That's why I think alcohol is a very dangerous sort of slippery slope, and it's so easy. You Once the gate is open, it's very easy to just keep doing it.
And as a system, which is so, which comes down so hard on things like cocaine or heroin, why has alcohol got away so easily with it?
I have my working theories, but I don't want to speculate.
Okay.
But I
No.
think I wish I could. My
Okay.
working theory is that it was just lobbied by more successful people. There
Okay.
was a time and place when MDMA was legal. There was a time and place when many of these substances were legal. I think that it was just lobbied by a more effective body, and
Mhm.
to alcohol's credit, if consumed responsibly, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
If consumed responsibly,
The if being the operative word.
if is
Yeah.
the operative.
Because a friend of mine who's a doctor and he works with a lot of patients who have mental health issues, and he said, um, in India has a huge history, a very very long history with hashish, with marijuana. In fact, even if you look at Vedic texts, it's referred to over there, but it's hugely um, looked down upon. It's illegal, um, and marijuana and hemp, the plant, have such benefits, but it's completely wiped out because of certain cultural narratives which have demonized it. And that's strange, right? That you are now having a modern India, which I'm not saying celebrates alcohol, but it's accepted, where one of the signs of success is that, open up a bottle of Shivas or a bottle of Johnny Walker Gold as you get more money. But the same society calls people, potheads or stoneheads. I'm just saying, in the ability to create a new context, we still seem to get mired with the old messaging that has been passed on.
That's the reality. I think most over the world.
Yeah.
And look, the reality is cannabis, if used responsibly, can also be something. I mean, the cannabinoid system, medically speaking, is amazing. It can deal with chronic pain. It can be used to get people off opioids. It can be used to help people with anxiety. There's a lot of good that can be done using it if used responsibly.
Yeah.
I think the image that is portrayed that all people who use cannabis are these useless stoners who sit around drooling without making any meaningful contribution to society is also ludicrous. There are these shortcut. Look, I think everyone knows someone
Mm.
who smokes too much marijuana, and
Yeah.
everyone knows someone who drinks too much alcohol, and everyone knows someone who abuses too much cocaine. Everyone knows these. Those are not the examples that you have to look at. You have
Yeah.
to look at, as part of a responsible, responsive life, what are the things that we should and shouldn't do? What are the levels we should and shouldn't have? That's
Yeah.
the difference. And I think the problem is that it's the devil is in the detail, the poison is in the dose.
I wish some of these things were spoken about in school. You know, when a teacher or a someone who's you look up to at certain parts of your schooling time, because when you're say entering your teenagers, you're like, oh man, I wish I could have, I wish I could get smashed, because you watch it in movies, or you've heard it, or you've heard an elder brother and elder sister doing it. But I wish it was spoken about in a much more mature way. I know the kids may not be mature, but I think hearing it saying, just like what you said, your parents might drink occasionally. They might have a drink every day. Some parents might drink more than other parents. And you might have had an experience as a child where your parent got drunk and hit you or yelled at you. And you might have a completely different opinion of it. But I think just having these conversations without seeing it like, say, on CSI, where there's an alcoholic guy who killed his whatever partner. I feel I feel it's just the environment in which, I mean, I'm just taking myself back to when I was 13 or 14. If I had a teacher who I looked up to, or someone who spoke to me without saying, sex is bad, do not do it, or do not drink, or it was so extreme, the view on it. Like, if I catch you with, a pack of cigarettes, I'm going to expel you. The messaging is so, either it dares you to, or it terrifies you,
I think you've nailed the hammer on the head. I mean, the studies out of the US that show that if you teach people sex education, if you teach them meaningful sex education, things like protection, how options work, prophylactics, you will
Consent.
find
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
consent, you find the rates of things like youth pregnancy, of sexual assault go down dramatically. Compare and contrast that to education of abstinence only. That's your only option. STDs, teen pregnancies, and sexual assaults go up.
Mm.
You have to, what I think a lot of these systems do is they fail to take into account a practical and pragmatic view of the human animal. Humans are not logical, they're psychological, and psychology is a complicated field. And coming at it from a perspective of everyone must be perfect all of the time is ridiculous.
Yeah.
How do we account for the reality that people are fallible, and how do we keep that in mind? That's the game.
Yeah, because good people do bad shit, and bad people, I mean, again, we got the good and bad, but it's again this
Bad people do
circumstances.
good things all the time, and good people do bad things all of the time. People are
Oh yeah.
complicated, and I think that that's the if your listeners take only one thing away from that, it's this understanding that, one, people are complicated and there is gray, and because you've done a bad thing does not necessarily make you a bad person. And two, mental health is very, very complicated. However, I think genuinely it can always get better. There are things you can do, but you need to get support. You need to speak to someone who knows you. You need to go see a professional. You need to try different strategies. Um, don't give up on yourself.
Because I think that's so important, because we tend to look at someone who's done these things for whatever reason, right? And the judgment is passed before even judgment is passed in the justice system. As a collective, we judge, whether it's a classmate who did something wrong, a friend in our circle who did something wrong, a colleague who did something wrong. And this idea of wrong, again, is just taken up. And as you said, we point our nose, we look down at this person going, oh, never. And this ability to accept an apology and say sorry meaningfully, and it taken into consideration by the group, and forgiveness, these are such powerful, they're not legal tools, but do you think that they can actually be social tools that can give a person a second chance?
When I spoke at TED, and I think that's how we kind of cross paths. When I spoke at TED, and I say this sincerely, the power of a well-spoken, genuine apology from a place of actual remorse is so profound. And I've seen this. I've seen the difference. Somebody might go to jail versus might walk walk out of that courthouse and go back with their family. A person may lose their business versus they may get, more runway and they can rescue their business or their family. People who may have never seen their children again reunite and have meaningful relationships. You have The power of sorry is profound, but you have to mean it. It needs to cut through. Now, just because you apologize and you're ready to apologize doesn't mean that everyone will be willing and able to accept that apology.
Yeah.
But I think it is one of the most powerful and poorly understood tools as human beings, because we have pride and we have ego, and I'm guilty of this too. I've lost people in my life because I've been too proud to say sorry the way that it's supposed to be said. And what a tragedy. So I think it's not even a legal tool, it's a human tool.
The importance of it is something I um, recognize, because when I, just to give you a little context, I put out a special in 2020 called "Thank You, I'm Sorry," um, because those words are so powerful, but if not used in the way they are meant to be used, with the meaning behind it, with the empathy behind it, with the gratitude behind it, or with the acceptance behind it, they're just words that you can use to cope, just like alcohol, just like drugs. Because I did that for years, right? I would say thank you because I felt inadequate as a visually impaired child. And I would say thank you for everything. If someone said, your, even if it was a fair thing that which I was due, if someone would give that to me, like for instance, I would, um, of course, I'm not saying I shouldn't thank them, but I would just say it as a way to get accepted into the tribe. And by not saying that, I would be shunned. And again, I would use sorry for that. I would apologize not because felt I was sorry for what the act I did, but if I was saying sorry for who I was. And those two things, those two words, was so which cast such a shadow on me for years, because it made me, in my head, feel completely inadequate, and um, as a result built up so much resentment. And finally, when I did acknowledge it and write this show, um, it was almost like I'm done with these words in the way they were used. But now I completely appreciate what you're saying, because if you can easily say sorry 100 times to your partner and still continue doing the same shit. And after a few months, a few years, the word has no meaning, because they'll say, hey, you just say it the next day because it's just a word. But that one sorry versus the thousand sorries, when it's coming from a place of, you know what, I'm making an effort, I've changed, and the sorry comes with physical change in you, it's profound, as you said.
Yeah, you've nailed it. And sorry can be used as a social lubricant to just
Yeah.
get us through the day, to avoid a confrontation that we know we need to have, to forgive a bad behavior that we don't intend to change.
Yeah.
But it can also be beautiful and deep.
Yeah.
When I'm having superficial interactions, I would say, "How are you?"
Mm.
Because I don't care. But when I actually want to connect with someone, I go, "How are you really?"
Yeah.
And just adding that word "really,"
Yeah.
it opens the door. And so, look, I'm not telling people to go out there and spend all of their time, really digging in, because it's emotionally exhausting and it's tiring. And truthfully, not all interactions are worth it.
Yeah.
The person that you might see, that you might have and I'm fairly sure the person serving me a coffee just wants to serve me a coffee and go on with their life. They don't want a deep down analysis of how our relationship is, if it's a fairly transactional type of exchange. But with the people who are nearest and dearest to you, you should be checking in.
Yeah.
You
And
should
I'm
be
going to add
checking
to
in.
that by saying, if you are constantly saying thank you and sorry to the world outside, the daily interactions, and not saying thank you and sorry to the people who matter, that's when you're not adding weight to those words.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely,
because we end up
absolutely.
pleasing the whole world, and we say thank you, and we this thing, because we don't want to be seen as vulnerable to the outside world. But the people who are helping us with our, the core group, if you want to call them, like your parents, your family, and you don't want to acknowledge them, you don't apologize for them, for the things you've done. And that means actual physical apology, physical thank you, which is showing it through the act of thanking and the act of apologizing. If you don't do that, then you clearly not understanding the depth of what those words can do and what they mean.
Yeah, I agree. I agree fully. And look, a big part of my job is telling a person's story, maybe with words they don't have, and telling it through a context that they don't have, which is the law, right? And a big part of that, I think, is being empathetic. My job is to humanize my client, take them from the accused or the accused or the criminal, and turn them into Soapy,
Yeah.
turn them into Jahan, and show you as a human being, and show the good in you, and show the things in you that matter. And it's a privilege to do that. It's difficult, but it's a privilege.
I can imagine the power of the human connection which comes out of that, right? Because when you are just a contract, or you're just a signature, or you're just an ID number, or you're just a docket number in the court, it's so easy to just pass judgment as a public, going, yeah, and put these tropes on them, right? Yeah, I'm sure he's this skin color. As a result, he's pushed into doing this. And it becomes a very intellectual debate that you can have on social media and say, I told you this is going to happen, and make it into policy, which you can then debate about when becoming president. But when you say, hey, Sandeep, who had this, it automatically just goes deeper down into the human experience, which then I don't know. There are still some people who sit over a latte and have an intellectual session about it, but it just makes it that much more human, as opposed to just a file number.
That's exactly, and it's bringing out that complexity, and it's explaining, not always justifying, but explaining how we got to where we got, and how we're going to go from where we got to where we need to go. And that's about being a human being. It's one of the beautiful parts of this job, is that for many people, I'm the first adult who's ever taken an interest in their life story.
And that's so sad.
I
mean, it's so
it's
amazing if you do it, but it's so sad that it
It's
hasn't been
heartbreaking.
done. Yeah.
Absolutely. Many people live lives of quiet desperation, and I think it's important we as a society love to celebrate the exceptional. We look at, Elon Musk, and we look at these athletes who are, but there's a beautiful, quiet dignity and respect to the everyman. And for many of them, men, women, they don't feel seen. And feeling seen is more important than physically seeing someone. You probably have an appreciation of this that goes far beyond anything that I can ever imagine. But the ability to have people, to know that people are, when you speak to them, or when you something about you makes them see what is inside them.
No, it's an amazing feeling. And I remember reading this book by Don Winslow. It's called The Cartel, and it's talks about the entire Sinaloa cartel. And there's one character which really resonates what you just said. He's this African American guy, wrongly imprisoned, and every day he writes a letter to Obama at that point to get a pardon, or he's written a letter, and he's counting off the days, waiting for a pardon. And in his head, he's like, we've got a brother in the White House. That's what he says in the book. And it's just heartbreaking, right? The hope that this person, but the complexity of this person, he mentors the younger prisoners. He's just one of the best human beings. Who was outside would make society a better place, but all he's doing is wasting away his life for this hope that he might get a pardon. And it just captures what you said in a nutshell, right? That this humanity is so strong wherever it is, but we undermine it by these trivial terms, and we don't. We wait for these highlights, as you said. We celebrate these achievements, which nothing wrong with, but there's so much dignity in every human being, but it's not recognized and appreciated because it isn't matching the top three things that we need to be celebrating.
I agree, and
Yeah.
and that's exactly, you've nailed it on the head. It is this malaise that human beings have far more in common than they do different. That's
Yeah.
why racism racism is so stupid. That's why sexism is so stupid. That's why, judging people on arbitrary characteristics is just insanity.
Yeah.
There's enough reason to like and dislike people based on their actions, based on the way that they behave, that you should be very, very quick to dismiss ridiculous notions like because of someone's inherent race or because of someone's inherent, circumstances of birth, that you should write them off. Because we all know people who have circumstances of birth far harder than we can imagine, who've gone on to do wonderful and brilliant things. We all know people who have circumstances of birth where it should have been a golden carpet of pleasure, ease, and generosity, who've just destroyed themselves and destroyed others around them. And I think that all of those concepts are things that, when you look at the human, all of us are about, I would say, 9 meals away from being ravenous animals. And so just remember that. Be respectful, be kind.
Nice. Jahan, before you leave us today, I want to ask you a last thing. It's about a drug, a substance. I know I made it seem like it's all about drugs. The world is full of drugs. But, you spoke about the importance of your story being heard, recognizing the depth of that story, the constant shifting nature of the story. But it seems like we're in a position today where stories can be so easily shared, people's voices can be heard, and it's through the internet, it's through AI, it's through things. But what is this one drug, which I'm going to mention to you now? What is this doing to our society and crime? And that drug being, and not just crime, but mental health, and that drug being social media.
Very well said. Very well said. Social media, look, social media is one of, I have benefited tremendously from social media. It has given me a platform to share my views, my thoughts, and to connect with the world at large. But you would be foolish to think that it doesn't come with enormous toxicity. There is absolutely nothing you can say on social media that someone somewhere will not take the wrong way. And I remember I made a video of, I was playing with a cute puppy, and somebody said, "Why do you hate cats? You're a cat hater." Just nonsense, just absolute drivel from fools. There's a lot of that. And I think with the problem with social media, it's easier because I'm 36 and I know how reality works. I see an ideal that someone's posting and I know that's not reality. But for younger people, they think that that's actually it. And maybe I'm sure there's a small percentage of people whose life are picnics and sunshine.
Yeah.
But when you compare your everyday reality to someone's highlight reels, it starts to create a distorted sense in your mind about what reality is and isn't. And I found a lot of people are so desperate to showcase a life that they miss the present moment and they make themselves unhappy. Social media is a tool that you should be using it to make your life better. It should not be making your life worse. If it's making your life worse, then seriously consider either changing what you look at or disconnecting from it.
Well said. And just to add to that, I feel if we are one side, what you're saying is when you talk to your clients and it breaks your heart that no one's heard their story. And then on the flip side, you have what is a story, which is 60 seconds and what you can put into that. It just absolutely blows my mind that that's where we're heading. And I feel you can't live in 60 seconds. You can't get depth in 60 seconds. But what you can do is show off your nail polish for the day or how many push-ups you can do, which takes away the depth of humanity. And I'm scared about that because that's where you're being rewarded online.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and the thing is, you should never compare yourself to where someone else is today. You should only compare yourself to where you were yesterday. Because the reality is that while they may have all these profound advantages, I can tell you that I know some of the most successful people you've ever met. Many of them are very unhappy. And I've known some people that you've never heard of, and they are living lives of absolute joy and pleasure. And your only obligation is to find your purpose and live it to the best of your obligation. That's all you can do.
Well said. And thank you so much for sharing all these insights. And, God bless the work you do, my friend, because I think you hear about influence now and influencers who have millions of followers, and today they sell you organic cheese, and tomorrow it's vegan leather bags. I don't know what influence that is. Maybe good for them, but these thousands of conversations and lives you've represented and changed, I think that is truly influence. And thank you for doing that.
I appreciate you, Soapy. Thank you for having me on your show, my friend.
My pleasure, Jahan. Thank you. Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard, please do check out the other episodes on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And I would much appreciate it if you could like the video, share it with people who you think might enjoy it. And of course, do subscribe to the channel because it will help me and the podcast grow and reach more people just like you. So thanks again. Appreciate it.